This is the first PowerPoint on book reviewing. Okay, so why review books? Well, reviewing books can be a way to introduce yourself to any number of different types of communities. It could be introducing yourself to a local literary community, that is, start doing book reviews for the local newspaper. Or it could be a way of introducing yourself to a professional community. That is, you start writing book reviews for a professional journal. And this varies quite a bit in terms of what the need is. In some areas like history, for example, if you want to do a book review, you have to apply to the journal to do it. And in this case, it would be helpful if you had some clippings of other published work, or at least other work that you could show. In some areas, like in English language studies, usually, if you're a graduate student, that's good enough quality to allow you to write book reviews. And one reason that we're studying book reviewing is that it is part of the process of becoming a published writer. And I am making the assumption with this class that you have an interest in writing and that you're interested in publishing your work. And the book review process is all part and parcel of the same thing. If you write a book, then you want to get it reviewed. And it could be that you may want to yourself engage in book reviewing as a way of making some extra money, and as a way of introducing yourself to the literary community at large. But it's also helpful to know, even if you never decide that you don't want to ever write a book review after you do the one for this course, it's good to have some knowledge of how the book reviewing process works in terms of promoting a book that you may have written. And even if you are able to find a publisher for your work, then you still they still want you involved to varying degrees with promoting it. So. Okay, so some comments from the reading that you've had. Poole addresses the question, is book reviewing on the decline? And certainly it isn't. I think that saying the book reviewing is on the decline is a lot like a lot of what we hear about literacy being on the decline, and that's certainly not true. I think that in terms of literacy, we're more literate today, since it's a popular thing, especially with young people, to be on social media, and they don't want to present themselves as being, uneducated on social media. Though I'm sure many of you can think of examples of people who don't care about that without too much trouble. But it's interesting to me how a lot of times that people will gather together in different groups that have to do with language and so forth on social media. And book reviewing, there's more book reviewing going on online than ever before. Anyone can write a book review on Amazon, for example, or on Goodreads or any other number of places. And of course, as you can see from some of the information the author provides, there's always been this crisis in book reviewing, just like there's always been a crisis in literacy, going back to when people first started writing to communicate, going back literally to the ancient Babylons, 1500, 2000 years ago. So, before BCE, in that area. We have literary crises, and a book review crisis hasn't been going on quite that long, but we're constantly undergoing a literary crisis. and that has a lot to do, I think, with the nervousness that the older generation has about passing off power to the younger generation. So, uh, certainly, book reviewing is not on the decline. There are problems with people being able to make a living doing it and so forth that the author discusses in some detail, and we'll be looking at as well. Some of the problems that are regarded for book reviewing are this type of you know reviewers having a tendency to praise books too much, or to make comments that are just very unclear. One of which that she cites is a novel of exquisite refraction and angles, gorgeous but circumspect. I mean, what does that mean? What conclusions are you supposed to draw from that? She does address a little later on the problems with whether or not the book reviewer, to what extent a book reviewer might be a frustrated writer of literature. Certainly lines like that kind of hint at that. Or if you don't like each of Franzen's characters, you probably don't like people. And it's clear what the reviewer is saying in that instance, but it's, again, the praise is just a little over the top. So those have certainly have been some problems, with, and then getting enough books reviewed. That's another problem as well we'll be looking at. So do the reviews matter? Well, yeah, I mean, they certainly do matter in terms of if a book has been a bestseller by the time it makes it to paperback. Very typically when you open it, you might see as many as a half dozen pages of sentences or even paragraphs taken from book reviews that are used as part of selling the book. And that's another issue with book reviewing that's regarded as a problem, and that is that type of relationship between the book reviewer and the publisher. And the book reviewer certainly shouldn't be thought of as someone who is simply being used to sell more books. But the reviews do matter. They do matter in terms of which books get read, which books might wind up getting awards, and things like that. And books that get awards, an award can contribute to sales, because that, again, can go on the cover. And also it helps with the author being able to more easily find a publisher for that next book that they may be working on. So, yeah, they do matter. I've written a couple of book reviews recently, one of which was published a couple of years ago, and the other one will be coming out in 2019. And just in terms of the way that I wrote the second one is, they also should be talking about, the very typically you can get, when you do a review, you should get a free book. And the two reviews that I'm talking about that I've done recently, the first one, the one that's been published already, yeah, I did get a free book for that one, and that was one reason I did the review, so that I would get a free book, because the publisher wasn't giving any out, and I thought it was an interesting book that perhaps might want to use in the classroom, so I did a book review so I could get a free copy. And the second one, I read a capsule review in a magazine. I thought, by capsule review I mean just a very short review, like a paragraph. And I thought, that sounds interesting. So I went out and bought a copy of the book, and I read it, and I thought, I think people in my field of technical communication would be interested in knowing about this book. And so I wrote a query letter to, which is something else we'll be doing this semester, writing a query letter to a book editor at one of the technical communication journals, and was successfully able to interest her in seeing a copy of the book review, and it was subsequently accepted, and I just learned that it's going to be published in 2019. So now this fourth point: should a book review be a book report? This is something that's this is actually an important question. It doesn't seem like that it possibly would, and if you've taken very many English classes, I mean, you should have gotten this from first year composition, if you know, or if you didn't from high school, writing for high school English classes. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if your response is no, a book review should not be a book report. Well, actually, that's not true. It should be a book report in the sense that it should have some summary of the book, but it shouldn't be left simply as summary, or at least the type of book review that we're going to write shouldn't be left simply as a summary. There also should be some evaluation going. And in terms of how you go about evaluating a book, should you praise it, should you slam it? Well, I think the best thing to keep in mind is that the type of critical evaluation should be constructive. And another way that you can think about what you can do in addition to evaluating a book, and this is in a sense is a type of evaluation, but placing it into the context. And so often it's helpful if you know something about the subject matter, especially if a book is a nonfiction book. It can, certainly there are certain types of books, like, for example, if you're going to review a mystery novel, it would be helpful if you read a good deal of them, and perhaps even read some of the critical material about mystery novels, so that you have a context for reviewing them. If you don't like mystery novels, then you really should avoid reviewing mystery novels. And of course, the same idea applies to different types of nonfiction books. If I know a good deal about technical communication, and the first review that I was talking about, it was actually a textbook that consisted of essays by different people, and I think the book editors, they asked me if I would be interested in doing it, and I wanted a free copy of the book. So I said, yeah. But I think they found it somewhat daunting to try to do something like that. They weren't sure how to go about it, and I picked up some common threads, and one of the editors, after I gave them reviews, said, so that's how you do that. So, yeah, well, that's one way. So, but also in terms of context, another way to think about context, and this is especially true with nonfiction, that is, think about what the writer's argument is. What's the writer's thesis, and how well does he or she hold that thesis together throughout the book. So what about documentation? I think that it's a good idea to first with documentation. This isn't a book. Most book reviews are not research papers. Okay. If you do make reference to other works, then you need to include a bibliographical citation. If you do any type of direct quoting, it's a good idea in the text to indicate the page where the direct quote came from. And that's a courtesy to the reader. I think a lot of times students tend to think about documentation as a hoop you jump through for English teachers and for other teachers as well. But it's also, the thing to remember is that it's a courtesy to the reader. So if you use a direct quote, it's a good idea for them to know what page the reader should go to find that direct quote. And also, in terms of doing the bibliographical citation, for a novel, for example, that you might be reviewing, use MLA. For just about anything else, you would want to use anything in the social sciences or education. You would want to use APA. Chicago is appropriate for anything else, especially science and so forth, books. But yeah, it is a good idea to document. Now, it is possible to write a type of review, and this is something that Poole mentions, is that there is this fine line between writing a book review and writing literary criticism. Usually, a book review is going to focus just on. I'm kind of jumping ahead one question, but I'm going to go ahead and do that and come back to the other one. One difference between literary criticism and book reviewing is that in a book review, first usually deals with a new book, and literary criticism deals with books that have been around for a while. Typically, a book review focuses on one book. Literary criticism may talk about a number of different works, but it's certainly when an author comes out with a new book, a critic, a reviewer may write about that book, especially if it's someone who's an important author who's been around for a while, may write about that book in the context of all the other books, or maybe not all, but maybe a group, a particular set of books that the author has produced. Both John Updike and Philip Roth had characters who were professor writers that they wrote novels about, and if it was a new one in a series like that, then certainly it would be appropriate to discuss the new book in relation to the other books that are similar in that sense. So, but it is something of a fine line. The Poole cites Virginia Woolf, who said that that the book reviews usually deal with new books, and that the literary criticism takes a work and holds it up to a standard or principles for evaluation. Now, the second question, what are the criteria for professionalization in book reviewing? As Poole points out, today it's become even more diverse, and social media has created an environment where anybody can write a book review. Of course, that's true of any type of writing, too, as well. Anybody can write a novel and then take it and post it online. You don't even need Amazon or Barnes & Nobles or any of the other publishers who are providing platforms for books to be published and to be sold. You can create your own website and take your novel and save it as a PDF and put it up on your website, and then create tags so that people will know that it's there, and you'll probably not get as many readers as you would if you went with Amazon or Barnes & Noble, but just as anybody can write a novel these days, or any type of book, anyone can be a reviewer as well. And Poole mentions at one point that there are courses now being taught in colleges on reviewing, and she doesn't think that they've made much of an impact yet. That is, that editors are not asking for BAs or any other degree in English with coursework in reviewing, that you don't necessarily need even a college degree to write a book review necessarily. She says it does help to have clippings, and of course it's kind of one of those scenarios. Well, how do you get experience if no one will hire you? And there was a story in my family about one of my father's great aunts who wanted to get a job in a store, and so she went and applied, and they told her that she didn't. They didn't want to hire her because she didn't have any experience. She said, "Well, how am I supposed to get any experience if no one will hire me?" And so they hired her. But a lot of times it is difficult, though book reviewers are, on the one hand, book review editors are on the lookout for people, and there are some areas, I was saying in academics, if you're a graduate student in English language studies, it isn't that difficult to get someone to assign you a book to review, and even give it to you for free, and all that good sort of thing. On the other hand, at the other extreme, you have the New York Times saying that, well, we have hundreds of reviewers who are waiting for their first review, and even more local papers she cites, or regional newspapers like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution was one that she cites, and the Raleigh News and Observer saying that they have plenty of reviewers. But it does, I think, as I said, what we can do in terms of studying book reviewing can be helpful to us, and this is something that I have done as a writer myself. And it can help you to give you the background, so that even if you've not written a book review, you can conceivably write a query letter, which we'll also be studying, to an editor, and get the editor to assign you a book to review. Okay, so that final question is, Poole makes a reference to, is that we do live in an era when cultural authority has been challenged, and indeed we've been talking in academics about culture wars for really since the 1980s, and more recently it's started to become something that's been discussed in the press and so forth, and that challenge to cultural authority is something that we're seeing with book reviewing as well, where there's so much of it going on in social media. Okay, so what is the relationship between the publisher and the reviewer? Yeah, it is a somewhat testy one. The publisher may indeed use lines from book reviews as part of what they use to help sell the book. Typically, even with the hardback books, sometimes on the back of the book they'll have excerpts from reviews, and as you may have heard, sometimes they're not used. The publishers don't use them entirely honestly. They'll use ellipses to make the review look better than it actually was. But there is that type of a relationship, because the publisher does provide the books. Very often they provide press kits that will have information about books for editors to use to give to their writers. And so the publisher is providing all this information. Sometimes they may provide galleys of books. The galleys are what are, and when you're going through the printing process of publishing a book, it goes back and forth between the author and the publisher, and the last point before they go to a published book are what we refer to as, from galleys we go to camera ready copy, but the galleys are where the book is actually set up and laid out, the way that it's going to look after it's printed, and sometimes these are forwarded to newspapers. And one complaint the book editors have is sometimes they never actually get a copy of the book, and that's becoming more common these days, when it's less expensive for publishers to provide an electronic copy of the galleys or even the camera ready copy before it's actually published. And so that's related to the next question about how the editor chooses which books to review. Unfortunately, sometimes it may be which books the editor happens to have access to. In other words, which may happen to be in their office. So, and that can be a problem, because sometimes the better books may simply not be available to be reviewed. And then, of course, again, I'm going to kind of skip a question here and come back. But when you have a novel by a new novel by a major novelist, that very often is going to have some bearing upon which books are reviewed. And of course, you have to look at the numbers. A number that the pool cites is that typically there's about 150,000 books published every year. Out of that, the New York Times and the Washington Post are going to review about 2,000 every year. So that's a very small percentage. And then the Los Angeles Times usually does between 1,000 and 1,500. Now, there are book review journals like the Publishers Weekly, Kirkus News, Book List, Library Journal, and Forward, and so forth. All they publish are book reviews. But even so, I mean, and they may do like 4,000 or 5,000 a year. Even so, that's not. It's really just going to barely make a dent in the number of books that are published each year. And then when a major novelist comes out with a new book, very often the editor of the book editor is going to feel compelled to have that new novel reviewed, because thinking that a lot of people will be interested in knowing about it, and they may be more likely to get a copy of it from the publishers as well. It doesn't matter if it's a good book or not. Even major novelists write mediocre novels sometimes. And of course, again, there's going to be, even though we have, with these numbers that we have of novels that are reviewed, the major novelist or the important nonfiction book, if when the a president leaves office, it seems the first thing they do is they write a book about their time in office. Those big important books are going to be reviewed by multiple publications. So the number of actual books that get reviewed becomes ever smaller and smaller. And very often those major books, they become the lead article, and so that's not only does it get published, and not only are there multiple reviews, but as the lead article, it's going to tend to be the longest one, and so by its being the longest one, it's going to take up more room. And typically there's like a book page or maybe a book section in most newspapers, like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It usually just has like a couple of pages in the Sunday edition. They may have some other reviews during the week, but they have even less space. Usually it's just a couple of pages. Now, the New York Times, on the other hand, has a separate supplement in the Sunday New York Times devoted to book reviews. So, okay, so and then the problems with even some of the other types of gatekeeping functions that we have is that Poole comments. She says that the awards are unreliable. Okay, I guess I know one type of controversy in terms of awards. The short story has become somewhat an endangered species in commercial publishing. Most short stories that are published in the United States are published these days in literary journals. The New York Times is basically about the only major mainstream publication that publishes fiction on a regular, ongoing basis. It started to dwindle even in old, reliable sources such as the Atlantic Monthly. When I was a child, my parents loved magazines, and my father loved Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes. The only things he ever won, he won a set of steak knives once, and he won a set of ice cube trays. But I think he and my mother just loved magazines in general. My mother would always have a subscription to Redbook, which is very different back then. Didn't have the type of articles in it that it has today, where it looks like a second version of Cosmopolitan. But I can remember picking up Redbook back in the 60s and in the 70s, and every issue would have a half dozen short stories. I think the last time I picked up a copy, it didn't have any. So anyway, with these endorsements being unreliable, there are several awards for the short story every year. One is the O. Henry Awards. It's named for the short story writer O. Henry, who wrote The Gift of the Magi, which is trotted out every Christmas, where the poor young couple, the wife cuts off her long beautiful hair, to buy her husband a watch fob, and the husband sells his watch so that he can buy a clip for his wife's hair. Anyway, there's the O. Henry Award, and then there's the Best American Short Stories, and these have different editors, guest editors every year. The O. Henry has like 3 guest editors, and the Best American Short Stories has 1. And there's always rumors that a lot of times that the people who wind up in these collections, especially the O. Henry, since there's 3 guest editors, tend to have been students in MFA programs for that the editors have taught in. There's always some controversy. It's not all like that. There are other stories by other people who are who have been publishing for a good while, but there's always been a good deal of disgruntlement about some of the choices that are made. So I think that's what she's talking about with awards being unreliable. And the same thing might be said about endorsements. There might be a certain amount of back padding going on. And then the dishonesty, I think, really has more to do with the way that the publishers will use endorsements. That is, for one thing, there's endorsements that are gotten in 2 ways. One is from book reviews, as we mentioned, and clever use of ellipses can make a review look better than it actually was. Another is that publishers will contact people and say, hey, would you write a review of this book? And this is usually with well-known authors will read a book by someone else, either a peer or perhaps someone who is new, and then write a little review that the publisher will then take a few sentences from and use as part of how they promote the book, putting it on the jacket copy. So all of these are issues that we'll continue to be looking at in more detail as we begin pursuing the topic of book reviewing as a way of thinking about what writers do. Questions? I'll see you online.